Hello, everybody. Welcome to our panel on the open internet, opportunities and challenges beyond our borders. So my name is Flávio Wagner. I'm the president of ISOC Brazil, the Brazilian chapter of the Internet Society, and I will be here with you as moderator of this panel. So we are very happy and honored to have we here with us two very distinguished panelists. Jessica Herrera Flanagan, she's the Vice President for Public Policy and Philanthropy for the Americas at Twitter, and Joseph Lorenzo Hall, Senior Vice President for Strong Internet at the Internet Society. So this panel is one of the concluding activities of an online course on technical, political, and regulatory aspects of the Internet that is offered by CEPI, the Center for Education and Research on Innovation, based on the São Paulo Law School at Getúlio Vargas Foundation, in partnership with the Brazilian chapter of the Internet Society and with support from Twitter Brazil. So the course is highly inspired by the Internet way of networking model proposed by the Internet Society and by the open internet model that is promoted by Twitter. We covered along the course many different topics, always based on the Internet way of networking and open internet principles. The technical fundamentals of the open internet, intermediary liability, algorithmic transparency, content moderation, disinformation and hate speech, privacy, data protection and encryption, data localization and digital sovereignty, and internet fragmentation, among others. So this panel will be entirely conducted in English, but interpretation to Portuguese and Spanish are provided. The panel is being recorded and will be publicly shared on the CEPI and ISOC Brazil channels on YouTube later. The panel will have a duration of 60 minutes. We intend to have a very interactive and dynamic debate with our panelists, and because of that, I will propose various questions to them, and they will respond with brief interventions from around 5 minutes each. If time permits, some questions from the audience will be taken in the final part of the panel. And please pose your questions through the chat, and we'll be forwarding them to our panelists. So let's then start our panel. And as I said before, I will be making a series of questions to Jessica and Joe, and alternating between them to respond first. Let's start then with our first question. And I ask to our panelists, what is the meaning of open internet for their respective organizations? So how do you perceive the relevance of this concept of open internet, considering the global nature of the internet, which spreads over different countries and jurisdictions? So Jessica, let's start with you, please. You have to unmute yourself, Jessica. Oh, you can't unmute. Anna? Guilherme, we need some support.
They fixed it now. Sorry about that. I was trying to type the message.
Yeah,
Thank you. First of all, let me say in answer to the question that at Twitter, we believe that protecting the open internet is vital to fulfilling the potential of the internet as a global force for good and driver of economic growth. We define open internet as a global and singular internet that's open to all and promotes diversity, competition, and innovation. We've identified 5 key pillars that represent the foundations of the open internet. An internet we believe can be rights-based, and most importantly, it has to be durable in the face of innovation and the new realities of our online life that we are all facing every day. First, the open internet is global. It has to be available to all, and it should be built on open standards and the protection of human rights. That's critical. Second, trust is essential and risks being further undermined without transparency, procedural fairness, and privacy protections for those who are using it. Choice and control also over recommendations and ranking algorithms is the best way you're going to empower people. Fourth, competition, choice, and innovations are really the foundations of the open internet and should be protected and expanded, ensuring that incumbents are not entrenched by the laws and regulations that are passed. And lastly, content moderation is more than just leaving up or taking down content. And as regulation is contemplated, it has to allow for a range of interventions while setting clear definitions for content types. This is what users have told us that they want to understand context, and we agree with that approach. These principles reinforce the basic principles of human rights, in particular freedom of expression, freedom of information, and privacy. Laws that aren't compatible with open internet principles can affect the global nature of the internet, in addition to having adverse effects on freedom of expression. Similarly, legislation that focuses on content removal rather than processes can have unintended consequences and effects, for example, on competition and transparency. Thank you.
So, Joe, please.
Yes, thank you so much. I also want to thank you for having us here. This is a real treat. I couldn't find anything to disagree with what Jessica said, so I have a feeling that this will be less a debate and more a resonant chorus of open internet and internet freedom. I'm from the Internet Society, and at the Internet Society, our vision is that the internet is for everyone, and we mean everyone. We in our community, like our chapters, like the ISOC Brazil chapter, are just a wonderful group of humans. The ISOC in our community are champions of the internet, and we care really deeply about the future of the internet. Our mission is to support the development of the internet as a global technical infrastructure, a resource to enrich people's lives, and a force for good in society. That's a lot, but in order to accomplish this, we have some goals that we'd like to see the internet adhere to, and that would be that the internet is open, globally connected, secure, and trustworthy. And so one of those four words was open, right? And when we talk about openness in the open internet, the way we think about it is that the open internet allows people and organizations to mix and match technologies without permission and with minimal barriers. That's really important because the mixing and matching of technologies represents sort of the modular way we build new things in our digital online world. And without permission and minimal barriers means that you don't have to go get a license to create a new web page or something like that, right? You can sort of tinker on your own, and millions and billions of people can all tinker on their own and create new things. Sustaining and growing an open internet helps crucially to spur innovation and keep the internet fit for future applications. Some of these innovations are things that may not wow every user out there with a new app that does like TikTok stuff or whatever. They may be innovations that people never notice. Like, for example, a new protocol that makes things move more efficiently and have to send fewer bits across the internet, right? That's something you may not notice, but may dramatically improve how your phone or how your computer works. And to us, an open internet is an accessible internet. It is easy to connect to, and it is easy to use its services. And by accessible, we mean getting on the internet in terms of hooking up to it, but we also mean in terms of the larger notion of accessibility. Making sure that people from marginalized communities, people with disabilities, people that have certain kinds of impairments that make digital tools a challenge to interact with, that they're just as included in the promises of the internet as the rest of humanity. Thanks.
Thank you, Jessica and Joe. So we started very well at this with this pledge for the open internet that all our organizations promote. You have already mentioned things like competition and innovation. Let's dive a little bit into this. How do you see the relationship between the efforts that all organizations like Twitter and Internet Society are making for keeping the open nature of the internet and the promotion of competition, innovation, and inclusion? Let's start with you, Joe.
Oh, great. Sure. So competition, innovation, and inclusion. I had mentioned that by making sure that we have a modular internet and a internet with low barriers to entry, that helps with accessibility and including more people. There's also sort of a challenge that we face, which is making the internet understandable, in the sense that there are very complicated parts of the internet that some don't need to be that complicated. Some we have a lot of work to do to be able to explain some of how the guts of the internet work to sort of normal people or lay people, so to speak. So we have some challenges there that the open internet can't solve on its own, that we have to sort of work towards to accomplish. And the way I think about this, you could think of the internet as kind of like a meadow or a garden, a natural garden. And by doing certain kinds of things, you can promote the growth or stunt or prohibit the growth of certain kinds of plants, you know, so to speak, and flowers in that meadow or that garden or that bit of land. In the competition, innovation, and inclusion, I should speak slower, I'm sorry for the translators. Competition, innovation, and inclusion are sort of these key elements of all that. The innovation angle is very similar to inclusion in that if we can make things modular, if we can make things cheap and have low barriers for working with internet technologies, you're going to get young people or people with free time on their hands who can create the new kinds of things that may turn into the tools we use for tomorrow to accomplish the things that we want to down the line. Like, you know, there's been a lot of focus on augmented reality and virtual reality, and are those going to be big parts of how we interact with the internet? It remains to be seen. Competition is fascinating because competition is the one aspect of the open internet. It's so key because I remember taking a course in college and someone saying this intellectual property is the most perverse way of getting new things. And what they meant by this was that if you know what you want, you can pay for it and buy the thing. But if you don't know what you want, you have to have competition. You have to have ways for new ideas to fight it out and for certain ones to win the day. And so the open internet provides a natural incubation or a natural area for that kind of fighting out of new apps and new kinds of technologies to happen. However, we do worry about either companies putting the thumb on the scale in terms of helping their technology fight more than another and sort of taking over in some sense. We also worry increasingly about governments. If you think about the garden or the meadow analogy, creating it very difficult for us to grow certain kinds of new and innovative plants, so to speak, on the internet. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. So, Jessica, what would you say about competition, innovation, and inclusion, and the relationship to the open internet?
I think it's important to remember that the open internet is a framework for how technology and society can coexist in a democratic and participatory way. And critical to that success is competition, innovation, and inclusion and their interrelationship. So if you think about competition, that's crucial for our industry to thrive. And we believe the open internet relies heavily on it. We have to allow new innovators to enter the market. If we don't, the technologies we have won't continue to advance. If you think about it, the technologies we have today have been allowed to develop because there weren't high thresholds for entry and people could enter the market. There was competition. For innovation to thrive in our industry, it's critical, and this gets back to the competition point, that we do not entrench incumbent companies. If we do, it's going to make it impossible for smaller upstarts to enter the market and get a foothold. Regulations have to enable and allow companies, current and future, to innovate, whether in content moderation, privacy, or beyond. More than most services, we're actually acutely aware of the risk of lumping in small services with much larger ones, who, frankly, have vastly more resources at their disposal. And that really can threaten the open internet. We can see regulation that tries to address concerns regarding large incumbent companies. It might have unintended consequences of actually empowering them even more as we're trying to take away that power. That is, many of these companies don't have the resources to comply with regulation. They may even welcome it as it reinforces their dominance and forces emerging and smaller companies to leave the market because they can't comply. So because of that, we at Twitter are regularly asking regulators to consider how proposed measures impact dominant emerging players and whether they may create insurmountable barriers and compliance costs for relatively smaller companies and new markets participants, thereby harming innovation. As far as inclusion for Twitter, we think our efforts to push forward the public conversation and give people voices online is an amazing thing. It promotes democracy. It promotes the participatory way that is the framework I mentioned earlier. We can only continue to do so through innovation. For example, by promoting health and providing a safe place for people. So competition, innovation, inclusion are the critical framework behind the open internet.
Yeah, thank you, Joe and Jessica. So we are talking about a kind of ideal internet that is open, it promotes competition and innovation, it fights for the inclusion of all in all regions of the world. But we know that this is the internet, although in the beginning, 30 years ago, we hoped for this ideal internet to keep on and on. We see now that there are many challenges. And considering a global perspective, the fact that the internet is global, it's across all the countries, and the fact that we want to keep a single globally connected internet, what do you think are the main challenges for keeping the open internet these days? And Jessica, let's start with you now.
I totally agree. We have to look at it from a global perspective. And it's important to recognize that the potential consequences of a restricted, stymied internet, they're vast. And it's bigger than any one company or any one platform. It's important that as we consider the survival of the free and secure open internet, we recognize the pressures that are driving a lot of the things behind regulation and efforts to approach the internet and companies. We know that, for example, the pressures driving internet regulations are wide-ranging. They highlight the diverse challenges, competing policy priorities, and harms that societies have to handle as a consequence of the expansion of technology in our lives. I mean, that's what's driving a lot of this. The manner in which these challenges are addressed is going to affect the services of all sizes and the ability of billions of people to share information with the world and hear from others across the borders. And that's really important because the potential consequences are vast and they go far beyond a headline today or tomorrow. The danger is that if we're designing regulations around the services we have today or a specific incident, the future of the internet is going to be defined by them and constrained by them. Regulatory approaches to new industries have been shaped by the policy response to address challenges of the Industrial Revolution, often focusing on frameworks that specify standards for outcomes of processes. Such an approach, though, struggles to adapt itself to the unpredictable and rapidly evolving nature of the human use of technology. These policy issues faced are often rooted in societal changes, and as a result, they demand a response from society as a whole. And so as we think about from a global perspective, we have to look at the open internet as a society as a whole and how that influences everything.
Yeah, Joe, please.
I find myself violently agreeing. Once again, it just makes so much sense. I'll mention a few challenges to the open internet. I think the first is that, two challenges, but a quick little aside. We have to recognize that half of humanity is not connected right now and has no internet access. That's relevant to the open internet because the more people we can get online sooner, the more people that will come to know this version of the open internet. The internet model is dominant right now, and that's a good thing. But the more people we can get on, we sort of build in a natural protection against things moving away from the open internet because people will be like, well, geez, I wanted the thing that we used to have. What happened to that, so to speak? But to get to the two challenges I wanted to highlight, I think the first that's really apparent to me, someone who's been working in technology policy for about 20 years, that governments around the world have increasingly, especially lately, determined that now's the time to regulate. Now's the time that they can affect the internet by passing laws or by making specific demands of technical infrastructure. I think the case of internet shutdowns, shows that, governments reaching out and either demanding or instrumenting their internet infrastructure so that, people cannot communicate. And in some cases, not during security incidents, but during annual exams. So the internet doesn't work for parts of the world during the annual exams, which is really nonsensical in my opinion. So governments have woken up and understand that this is a thing that we can affect and we can pass laws or we can order people to do things to the technology. And a lot of those laws and a lot of the plans to change the technology are not very clueful. They sort of lack awareness about how the underlying internet and these digital systems actually work, the way they function. that ends up being quite a bit of the work we do on the policy side. And I'm sure Jessica may agree that, you know, you have to essentially describe potential effects if they do what they say they're going to do in a way that they understand. Ooh, maybe we don't want to do exactly that. Maybe we want to do something that's a little more carefully tailored to the thing we're trying to solve, the problem we're trying to solve. And hey, maybe we should avoid unintended consequences and think about those before we do these things. I think the second thing I would mention in terms of challenges is the technical challenge of the open internet. There are really powerful forces that want to see decentralized parts of how the internet works now to be increasingly centralized. I'll mention there are some proposals being forwarded by China and Chinese companies in places like the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, under the name of New IP. That may not make any sense to any of you, but just know that there are proposals to change how the internet works to be less distributed and less about connecting networks and more of a top-down command and control kind of a network architecture, which would dramatically affect the openness of the internet and the ability for the innovation, competition, and inclusion that we see now to happen. So I mentioned a quick little aside, but I said the governments have now woken up, and I think we're starting to see sort of technical proposals that would fundamentally change how the internet works, and we're fighting those very hard, but it's going to take a while. Thanks.
I was muted, sorry. So you both already mentioned the potential impact of regulations. And we know there are today regulations being debated in different regions of the world, in different countries. I would like that you explore a little bit more how these different regulations may impact and threaten the internet in the coming decades. Are there particular risks regarding regulations that worry you more? Is there maybe a risk of a race to the bottom in the development of global regulatory standards that may affect the open internet? That you try to reach a kind of minimum consensus among regulatory standards, and that will make things worse for the internet we want. Let's start with you, Joe.
Thank you. So I think about this. I am an American, and I've done a lot of work just inside the United States. And just inside the United States, we have a similar problem that we have globally, but it's very tiny and very American, which is that you can get 50 different states that have different laws, and that can pose really serious problems to figuring out, well, what can I do in any given place? We're starting to see that in a lot of respects with the internet. And you can imagine that business interests and others are like, please, can we just decide on something that is the same many places so that we can at least, not have to adapt everything we do to every single place that we work. I do think that we have a really good story to tell here, which is the Internet Society working over the past 2 years with our chapters and our community, like organizational members. We've developed a method for thinking about potential impacts of regulations on the internet, and we call these Internet Impact Assessments. If you're familiar with other areas of regulation, there are things like environmental impact assessments. You have to do an assessment before you put a new factory in on how the effects of that factory might affect the surrounding environment, right? And privacy impact assessments is something I know very well about, which is when you establish a new database or a new system, you think about, well, how is this going to impact the privacy of the individual users? So these are internet impact assessments, and you can use these just like those other things in the sense that if there's a technical proposal or a policy proposal that would affect the internet, you can use an internet impact assessment to actually figure out what would the probable effects be. So you can show someone, hey, we've done an impact assessment, and here's what we think is going to happen. And just last week, at the Internet Society, we launched this thing called the Expanded Internet Impact Assessment Toolkit. It's a toolkit for doing these things. It has a bunch of features. It describes what we think as the Internet Society, the essential pieces of the internet are, so we have a common understanding of what the internet is. It has a how-to document that explains how do you conduct an internet impact assessment. And then we released a bunch of internet impact briefs, sort of short versions of an impact assessment that sort of show you examples of how you might actually write and conduct one of these impact assessments. And we released 5 of them around Canada, the European Union, and India. And just to give you an idea, from 2 of the European proposals, one of the European impact briefs discusses something called NIS2, the Network and Information Services Directive in Europe, the second version of it. As drafted, it would start to regulate operators of root domain name service servers. It would regulate certificate authorities. And it was written in such a way where I don't think the drafters understood that anyone who operates a root DNS server has instances of that technology in Europe, because you want Europeans to get quick responses to their DNS queries, right? Anyway, so long story short, we have argued that those things need to be taken outside of the scope of the regulation, because if they're placed in there, the impact on the internet would be quite grave. And last thing I'll say is that another one of those impact briefs is around a European proposal mostly from France and Germany to produce a digitally sovereign cloud infrastructure called Gaia X, GAIA-X. And that's a technical proposal that could affect the internet. And what we pointed out there is that there's nothing incompatible with this digitally sovereign cloud for Europe with internet principles. The trick is there could be some negative impacts depending on how it's implemented. Do you have to use the digitally sovereign cloud? Can you use other kinds of things? And so we think that these internet impact assessments are a really good way to show people what you think the impact of an internet impact or of a new policy or technical proposal might be. And we encourage people to conduct others. And we have a bunch and are happy to help if you want to think about a given technical or policy proposal and the potential impacts it may have. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. So Jessica, please.
I think in looking at it, there are really 2 different kinds of threats that we're seeing that concern us. I think on one hand, we've seen some governments try to use the threat of regulation to limit speech and squash dissent in certain places. How those challenges are addressed, they're going to affect the services of all sizes and the abilities of billions of people to share information with the world, the future of the digital economy, and the survival of the free and secure open internet. So that's one side. On the other side, there's a risk more broadly in a lot of locations and countries that regulatory interventions are actually going to undermine competition and entrench the incumbent services and reducing consumer choice, as I mentioned earlier. We know it's not unique that in the technology sector, incumbents will often try to say, yes, regulate us to protect their own market dominance. And just because services are aligned doesn't necessarily mean that they depend on the open internet. Indeed, in some cases, a less open internet may suit certain businesses more. That's why we at Twitter, we've supported strong net neutrality protections, which are needed to protect new entrants and innovators from well-resourced incumbents and infrastructure gatekeepers. So as we look at regulations, we have to think about, as I mentioned earlier, like how do we ensure that it is protecting new entrants? How are we ensuring that it's protecting innovation and moving us forward and not backwards? Specifically, if you look at certain types of legislation, so for example, regulations that attempt to undermine intermediary liability. This protection is a foundation of the global and open internet, and it's critical to competition online. We don't have that foundation, the internet as we know it, allowing speech, interaction, and the discovery of billions of people, it's going to not exist. These protections actually enable 2 crucial functions. One, they stop people from silencing others by litigating against a service rather than the person responsible for posting the content. So it's a voice silencer. Secondly, these services, without these protections, services are going to be forced to choose between expensive litigation or removing content on their service. Again, silencing voices, which is not what we want. Another area to kind of be concerned about is regulations that attempt to do a short list of content, creating a list of contents that can be moderated rather than relying on international human rights standards. Again, it could be a silencer of voices. And then lastly, I would say regulations that seek to restrain platforms' ability to moderate content. Quite frankly, we just can't take the open internet for granted. It's a unique driver of economic and social development. And with these types of regulations being allowed to flourish, it's a threat. It's both a threat for private and public actors. And it goes against the whole principle of being open and available to everyone.
Thank you, Jessica. So You both mentioned that this question of intermediary liability and this has a relationship also with, as Jessica mentioned, with new entrants. So if regulations, they avoid new entrants to come into the market. This happens because in most cases, regulations are thought only for the big platforms, for the business models of the big techs. So how do you think the big platforms business models influence the open internet? For instance, because regulations are aimed at those business models, and this harms the other actors in the internet. How do you think that the business models of the big techs today are influencing the open internet we want? So let's start with you, Jessica, please.
So this gets back to the ideas of competition and innovation and incumbency that I've been mentioning. If we have a less competitive internet, it trends towards a less open internet. As such, if we're going to focus solely on the size of a company and regulate accordingly, we run the risk of creating a bigger problem than we had in the first place. As I mentioned, there's a risk that some regulatory interventions are going to undermine competition. They're going to entrench these incumbent services, reducing consumer choice. For example, if compliance costs are high or require sophisticated technology to comply with the regulation, well, that oftentimes can only be met by a handful of large companies. Then market dominance prevails. New entrants or even mid-size entrants are going to be squeezed out of the market because they can't comply and they don't have the ability to receive those types of technologies and implement them in a way that's effective and actually promotes an open internet that's global. As I mentioned, this is why we support strong net neutrality protections and trying to ensure that we are protecting and enabling new entrants and innovators, and not just providing additional protections to well-resourced incumbents and infrastructure gatekeepers accidentally and unintentionally. Intermediary liability protection, as I mentioned, it's the foundation. It's what's critical to competition online. And that's what allows speech, interaction, and discovery of billions of people to happen. And that's without these types of protections, it's going to cease to exist. As I mentioned, to stop people from silencing others, from litigating against a service and just trying to silence voices. And we also see it potentially that protections that enable companies to take proactive action on content that might be legal but violate terms of services without the fear of litigation. Critically, they're going to enable services to set their terms of service to serve the audience best and give people what they want and allow them to communicate. We also believe that the technologies that underpin the ability to address and remove the most harmful content and respond to further harms remain in proprietary silos. And that becomes exponentially more effective as businesses scale, furthering enhancing dominance and undermining competition. You'll see that theme that I've mentioned several times. It enhances dominance and undermines competition, which is not good for the open internet. Content moderation technology, that's one of the most significant barriers to entry, particularly as regulators set even stricter requirements on the time taken to remove harmful content. What we would encourage policymakers to do is to facilitate a fundamental change in the ability of proactive technologies and the data that underpin them to enable new services and tools to be made more accessible. Accessibility, that's an important word here, to a greater range of services, including providing a robust legal framework for information sharing. These are all things that are important to furthering the open internet. And one of the key things is it's not just one entity that's doing it. It's just not government. It's not academia. It's not technology companies. We all have to work together to try to further the open internet and achieve the goals that we all want to achieve together. Well, most of us want to achieve together. And so that's going to be key as we go to the future as well, public and private partnerships.
Yeah, thank you, Jessica. Joe, if you talk about big businesses, business models, you may also mention maybe that some of those big techs are considered to be walled gardens, and this would be maybe at odds with the open internet. What do you think about that?
Absolutely. So you asked, how do big platform business models influence the open internet? And that there are books about this, and you could write whole new books about this too. So we don't have time to go into a ton of depth, but let me just start where you prompted me, Flavio, in that there are a lot of people who their experience with the internet happens almost entirely through one or a few very specific platforms, greatly shaping what they can and cannot do online. So some people may understand that a very different thing about the internet, that it's only this way of posting and commenting or something like that, rather than this really generative, rich sort of basis for building arbitrary kinds of things that you might want in our future. So there's that, right? And the thing that I think about is you can almost see that the big platform business models are naturally you can see it through regulation, that and all the there's so many new regulatory proposals coming out, and many of them try various way of carving out smaller actors, right? So that, oh, well, this regulation is meant for the big bad guys, not for the smaller ones. And sometimes that works, but often, just as Jessica had said, there are capabilities that are being assumed or built into some of these proposals that smaller companies just can't do with their capacity, or without needing a whole bunch of extra resources that they either have to spend time and money on, that the big guys, it's a rounding error in for them often to do some of this stuff. And as Jessica mentioned too, some of these tools that are being considered to be built into regulation are proprietary tools. So they're fundamentally not things that have been built, via an open, collaborative, standards-based process. And again, some of these tools do things that we consider courts should do, right? Like adjudication, or deciding what speech should be available on a platform in particular jurisdictions. I think there's also, and I'll post this in the chat for everyone, but I'll have to describe it. There's some interesting research that's come out. This is from a recent Internet Measurement Conference paper from Kashaf, Sekar, and Agarwal that talks about third-party dependencies in the modern web. And it's a technical paper, but what I'll tell you, you don't have to be technical to understand it, is that a really quick analysis they did shows that something like 89% of the top 100,000 websites are critically dependent on one or two infrastructure providers, so DNS, hosting, some variety of things, right? And that they also see that these kinds of things have become more consolidated over time, from 2016 to when they measured in 2020, which means that the stuff we're seeing where there are big, application level platforms, so apps that people interact with, websites that people go to all the time, that there's definitely that user experience where some people only have the notion of this thing as the internet, whereas they don't understand that there's email, there's other kinds of things that also exist on the internet. But then you also have this consolidation that's happening in the infrastructure level, where increasingly fewer providers are providing these kinds of services. And that's something that we're thinking about at the Internet Society. We have a measurement project that in the near future will be launching a centralization focus that tries to show you to what extent are certain parts of the internet concentrated or centralized or decentralized. And so we're excited about that. I will say that this also comes up in the standardization context, that in order for these platforms to talk to one another, underlying all these platforms are standardized computer protocols, ways for computers to talk to each other. And those are hammered out in places like the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force, the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, the IEEE, the International, what are the E's for? So, electrical engineers. I'm missing what one of those E's is for. Anyway, whatever. And these platforms, these businesses have to get together in these standards contexts to discuss, hey, how are our computers going to talk to each other, right? And they really value those underlying protocols being interoperable, being performant, being quick, sending few bits of data when you don't need to, and in general allowing greater and more significant uses of this global network of networks we call the internet. These companies have opinions in these standardization contexts, but what pushes back against the influence being, the internet fundamentally designed by proprietary interests or by company interests or whatever, or even government interests, is the multi-stakeholder model, is the open nature of good standards processes that allow outside voices from academia, from civil society to participate. And that's by no means a panacea, but that's a key part of the open internet, is being able to have these rich set of voices that can talk about their lived experience and how certain features of the internet may help them either live their lives or do things that they never thought they could be able to do with new tools. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. And you are already addressing the subject I would like to address now to both of you, which is the multi-stakeholder model. So you mentioned the IETF, the W3C, and so on. So we are used to have this multi-stakeholder model working on the definition of technical standards and at ICANN in the operation of the DNS, in the distribution and regulation of the domain. It's not regulation, but in fact, the organization of the critical resources of the internet, the domain names, the IP numbers, and so on. So, but now we are talking here about the open internet and challenges that are not at this technical infrastructure level. We are talking about things like platform regulation, content moderation, and things that threaten the open internet at a different level. So, in your vision, how does this multi-stakeholder model support an open internet if we think of this more broader concept, this broader concept of not only the technical infrastructure, but also at the content and application level? What should we expect from the various stakeholders, the governments, the private sector, the civil society organizations, academia, technical community, in supporting the open internet in this broader context? So Jessica, what do you think?
I think an important thing to look at is the commonalities, because the internet by its nature is global. And we look at the open internet is like, how do we enable culture? How do we enable history? How do we do it in a way that allows for this global technology to advance? And I say that that type of approach is not new. We've seen it in the past in areas such as cybersecurity or data security and other area, information security, whatever you're looking at. And countries, governments, nonprofits, civil society, companies have come together to think about that. So I think the commonality that we have to be looking for is the principles. That's what is underlying the open internet. It's not being prescriptive. It's not saying you have to write a piece of legislation that does X, Y, and Z and not these specific things and giving the specific language. That's why we have said that there are 5 pillars that as entities come together and talk about what the open internet is going to look like in the future, let's build it around these pillars, allowing cultural and historical and innovation within each country to thrive in the right way, but agreeing on what we're all going to say we're going to try to do. So those things, as I mentioned earlier, that's, the global open standards. Like, how do we create and do open standards? That's one of the reasons that at Twitter, we have been very supportive of looking at a decentralized approach to the internet. We're calling it Blue Sky, where we're going to give people more choices. We're going to extend the control to choices, between like ranking and algorithms. It's going to expand open standards. It's going to drive new opportunities for innovation and competition. And so as other services try to build silos and centralize more and make it harder for governments and entities to think about regulation, if you have a more open choice-based future, that allows for entities to come together around principles. So the open standards, trust, how do you build transparency, fair treatment of content and privacy into what you're doing in a way that's effective? Again, a lot of that will rely on culture and history as you think about the concepts. I mentioned algorithm choice and control before, competition, choice, innovation, and then the content moderation with context, recognizing that taking down content in and of itself doesn't solve the issue. It's not what users are desiring. They want context. They want to be able to understand. So if we agree on these principles, you can build a framework that then governments, nonprofits, academia, and companies can come together and think about how that is relevant in each of the markets and design things accordingly.
Yeah, so Joe, you mentioned the multi-stakeholder model regarding the IETF and ICANN and W3C. Do you think there is a role for the multi-stakeholder model in supporting the open internet, considering the current challenges we face?
Oh, absolutely. I think, as I mentioned at the very beginning, at the Internet Society, we say the internet is for everyone. That's our vision. And, what we mean by that is the internet is for all of humanity, all of global humanity. We're not doing so well there since half of humanity is not connected, but we're working on it, and we're all working on it together. But in order to make sure that this, the internet in some senses is a way for billions of people to talk to billions of other people. We've never, ever had an element of human interaction or engagement that allowed that. And with that, there are growing pains. Sometimes I sit there in front of my computer, I'm like, maybe billions of people don't need to be talking to billions of other people. But, very, very wonderful things happen out of all of that. And what that means is that you have to have ways of interacting and shaping this new global resource that, focus on humanity and focus on how humans organize themselves. And, humans do organize themselves into national governments. They organize themselves into businesses. They organize themselves into clubs. I have a running club that I run with, right? And that's a small organization of humans. But each one of these groups has their own interests. And we cannot, I don't think we can say that your interests, that someone's interests are more important than another. What we can do is we can have them speak about their interests and how something may or may not affect their ability to live their lives and to build new things into their lives. And that's sort of the essence of the multi-stakeholder model. And when it applied to the internet is as amazing as it is and is as useful as it is because it has this organically generated sort of set of principles, and Twitter has mentioned they have 5. We have 5 too. I won't talk about them, but they talk about things like, a general purpose technology neutral network, these sort of foundational things that through them you can see the internet being able to support arbitrary things in the future. And, Flavio, you had asked, what do we think the responsibility is for each stakeholder community in the sort of curation or sustenance of the internet? And I think it's that they have to recognize that the internet is the way it is because of very specific design choices, because we want to make sure that it's not just for telephone calls, right? We want to make sure that it's for a whole bunch of things. And it's hard to see, and I have to, sorry, but governments right now are not doing a good job of recognizing the potential of the internet. There's a lot of fear-mongering around the internet, despite the fact we've just been through and still going through 2 years of a global pandemic where we see things like families, the only way they were able to say goodbye to a dying loved one is over a video call, right? And that's something we couldn't have done during, for example, in my country in 1919 during the Spanish flu. That just wouldn't have been possible. So there are things now that we recognize that we only have because of the internet and digital tools that I think we all have to recognize that we don't want to squander the opportunities here by putting it in a box and saying it has to look like this, but by understanding that it's going to grow, it's going to do things we don't expect, and we often are going to find social problems that are exposed through these things that we have to attack with social solutions and not necessarily technical or policy solutions aimed at the technology. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Joe. Let me take one question from our audience. Guilherme is asking, he's noting that each country has its own innovation culture, history, and rules, and legislation tradition. Does the open internet favors one kind of country's innovation or culture, for example, American or European, instead of others? So, Joseph, you mentioned before a metaphor about some types of flowers and plants instead of others. Do you think, Joe, that this may happen, that the open internet is in fact something that may favor one type of innovation culture?
I would need to think about that for much longer than I have in this few moments to give that. That's a really deep question to get out of me. I would say that there are certain things that seem to be just built into how the internet works that definitely come from certain, I don't know if cultural innovation culture is the right framing, but for example, intermediary liability, and you may have heard of Section 230 in the United States. That was sort of a foundation for understanding that people aren't going to put things online if you make them liable for everything someone says in their software that they wrote that happens to be a web page, right? If you're liable for everything that someone does with your tool, you're not going to build a tool. If someone that makes a telephone, if a telephone operator is liable for everything that people yell over a telephone at each other, you're not going to want to offer the telephone stuff. So there are things like that that I think, while they may come from particular bases or traditions, that they have benefited everyone equally. There are other things I think that you can see, like the cookie banners that are attributed to come from requirements from the European Global Data Protection Regulation and GDPR and other things. It's unclear what benefit those kinds of things are providing. I don't know if I call that an innovation culture, but it was an idea that once it ended up on the internet is more of a nuisance than it really is a help. The last thing I'll say is that I'd be really interested in making sure that we find aspects of innovation cultures that may either be depressed or suppressed. So in the flower analogy, maybe we're not growing certain kinds of flowers because we haven't incorporated into how our thinking about the internet works certain aspects, right? And that's something that there's probably a whole bunch of scholarship potentially there in terms of talking about different kinds of innovation cultures, and maybe that already exists. But I would love, Guillermo, to know more about potential things we are missing from other areas of either regional or national or even, I don't know, other kinds of innovation cultures, because that seems totally fascinating. And we should not only seek to preserve the internet, but we should seek to make sure we build things into it that make it even better in the future. And so I think that seems like a really promising way to think of that. Maybe someone's already done that, but I'm not familiar with that, but I'd love to know more.
Jessica, would you like to address this question?
Yeah, sure. I actually would argue that the open internet enables cultural history and innovation by locality. Underlying the open internet is the word open, right? So it's to be global, you have to take a decentralized approach that enables the localities. And as I mentioned earlier, if we can agree on the principles, the pillars that are underlying what is the success of the internet, then how different localities take their culture, their history, and innovation and implement those principles will lead to the success of the internet overall and the underlying framework for it. What it doesn't favor, I would say, are the increasing number of authoritarian regimes and pseudo-democracies that are trying to take control of the web and impact users and the broader ecosystem. Those things are weakening democratic norms. They're undermining the fabric of the web, and they actually threaten, I would say, the culture, history, and innovation of each of our different localities. And it's something that we need to try to address more effectively. So I would say it's an enabler if done right. And that's why we want to take a decentralized approach. That's why we want to have underlying principles. And that's why we also want to make sure that we're not undermining the fabric of the web through people trying to take over and control of it and impact users. And the only other thing I would say is there is an issue we haven't discussed, which is really user engagement. How do we also empower the end user? Because that's an important part of this too, wherever you're located. And giving people the choices and giving them the ability to affect their use of platforms, their use of the internet and sort of the future of it. That's what's allowed the innovation to thrive so far. And I think a part of it, as we think about this, we also have to think about how do we add to that? How do we give them more choice and control in a way that is culturally relevant?
Yeah, thank you. We will have time for a final question. Yeah, we are almost at the top of the hour. So even if we do not regard the authoritarian regimes that were mentioned by Jessica here, we know there is pressure for regulation, even in the Western countries, in the US and in Europe, Australia, and so on. So different countries, different regions are proposing their national, regional legislation. There are claims for digital sovereignty overall. There are pressures for data localization. So there's this dispute of jurisdictions among countries. This may lead to fragmentation. And fragmentation is, of course, fully contrary to the open internet. How do you both see this situation evolving in the very near future? So, Joe.
I don't know if I'm so hopeful. I wish I could say I was hopeful about various entities seeing the benefits of not having a fragmented internet, but it's not just authoritarians. That has been for very long. I mean, you know, under the Trump administration in my own country, we issued a whole bunch of stuff that was essentially, you shall not share any bits with Chinese companies, which, you know, is a little over the top when there are customers of Chinese companies that are our own national, whatever. So I don't know if I'm really worried that I think it's the next 2 or 3 or 4 years, we're going to see some pretty potentially big moves that could further fragment the internet. This is why we're thinking about things like Gaia X in Europe, which would provide digitally sovereign cloud services for European entities. That's the kind of thing that is great if it provides a whole new rich set of things that wouldn't otherwise exist there, but it's bad if it ends up being sort of a great firewall for Europe, right? And if you know, someone like Erdogan in Turkey could easily say, I want this rule set put in front of Gaia X, and then it affects the ability to communicate across a whole vast quantity of folks. I worry about a lot of those things. I think there are some good things pressing back against that. So, for example, you know, we're going to have increasing UN attention on cyber stability and these kinds of things. But in the end, like, there are a lot. If I were being a weather forecaster and the forecast was about internet fragmentation, I would be really worried, because between the efforts, like, and I'll mention China specifically, they're very keen to have this top-down command and control version of a new internet protocol in place, and you know, they have a lot of persuasive power, and especially in terms of giving money to certain countries, and that's the kind of dynamic that we need to see a more coordinated global response to. That's like, no, we don't want our internet to look like that. We want our internet to look like this. I do think that some of the pressure we feel right now feels like it's going to fragment the internet is often these cases where we're trying to find technical ways to solve social problems. And I really want to make sure that meanwhile, we're also evolving how we solve new social problems with that arise with our new global connectivity. So I am not particularly optimistic about the internet becoming less fragmented in the future. It feels like even just in Nigeria with shutting down of Twitter, for example, like it feels like that because the president said something that is demonstrably false. Those kinds of things, it just feels a little bit more brittle. Like all of a sudden something could happen and it's unclear where it's going to happen. And that uncertainty is not a really good place for the internet to be.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. Jessica, what do you think?
I agree with what Joe said. I think there are no easy answers, but if we can have continued collaboration across the sectors, not just with the technology sectors, but all sectors, and also with those governments who are willing to kind of discuss some more holistic approaches and civil society and academia, we can move towards a more holistic solution to these challenges. It's not going to be easy. You know, it is just tremendously challenging. And as I was mentioning, you know, the policy issues faced are often rooted in societal challenges and social issues. But if we're going to meet them, we're going to have to demand a whole of society response, and it can't be solved by one-off regulations. I would say that's one of the reasons we push regulators to focus on the principles. Let's not empower incumbencies. That's an easy thing to start with. Is like, how do we do innovation, not empower the incumbencies as you're trying to address these issues and realizing you're having a harmful effect? Because I think a lot of governments, that's not what they intend to do. they're trying to address the societal problem, but let's do it in a way that is going to allow new entrants. If we can do that and focus on that piece of it, it's going to allow us to then turn our attention to addressing the larger efforts of governments that are attempting to limit speech and squash dissent, and if impacting the entire ecosystem, including within countries where they aren't operating. So I think that is the challenge we face, is like, how do we first address those who are trying to do what is right by their culture and history in a way that enables the global internet and allows for competition? And then we can address the harder issue of free speech and dissent squashing.
So we are at the top of the hour. We had a very lively, very interesting debate here. I will allow you maybe a final message, Joe, Jessica, for our audience.
Say,
final word about the future of the open internet.
Thank you so much, and keep it open, everyone.
I would just echo, say thank you to everyone, and I look forward to continued conversations. Yeah,
thank you very much. Thank you to the Internet Society. Thank you to Twitter. Thank you for being here with us and at the audience. Thank you for this very interesting debate. And so bye-bye, everybody.